Welcome back to another episode of our month-long Women in STEM series in honor of Women's History Month. I'm Belen Cacho, an ant geneticist and science communicator. Along with this interview series for the entire month of March, we are raising money for Girls Who Code. Together, we can help close the gender gap in the technology fields. Please find the donation link in the show notes. Today, we talk with Dr. Inés Dawson, who holds her PhD in the biomechanics of insect flight from the University of Oxford. Originally from Spain, Dr. Dawson is known throughout the internet as a science communicator, Draw Curiosity. In this episode, she talks about her love of insects as a child, being told there are more appropriate research topics than insects for women, her love for math, the use of lasers and high-speed cameras in her research, BP, fly copulation, and her journey into science communication. Dr. Draw Curiosity, Dr. Inés, thank you so much for joining us for our Women in STEM, Women in Science History Month. It is an absolute honor to have you. Y'all, we knew Dr. Curiosity on accident because we had watched her YouTube videos as a way to augment our stream because it was such good explanations on insect neuroscience. And then it turned out that she was the Twitch streamer as well. And it was just the incredible worlds crossing over. You are absolutely incredible. And thank you so much for joining us today.
That is so sweet, Belen. Thank you so much. The honor is all mine. Thank you so much for having me here. And for inviting me on. It made me so happy to hear that people, use my videos as educational resources and that you had played the video on the channel. So if anything, that just makes me delighted. Thank you so much.
And y'all, it was before we had even met. And could you do a brief intro? Who are you and what makes Dr. Inés click?
Absolutely. Well, I guess I'll do the little spiel. Hi everybody, my name is Inés. I always say rhymes with face or with space, occasionally with disgrace, anything ending with ace. Anyway, I earned a doctorate from the University of Oxford in insect flight biomechanics. That was well over 6 years ago. At this point, it's been a long time now that I think about it. At the time, when it first came, it's felt recent for years, and then the pandemic happened, and I'm like, oh my God, I've been out of my PhD for longer than I was in it. So I love bugs, I love insects, I love the intersection of biology with anything else, mathematics, physics, engineering, anything where different disciplines can cross over together. I am mostly known for my work on YouTube. So I run the channel Draw Curiosity, where some of you might apparently be familiar with my videos because Brilliant has played them. And then I took a very long break. I was very burnt out. And then I decided to return at some point, just slightly under a year ago, along with the total solar eclipse that happened in Texas in April. And then I thought, you know what? A lot of people have said that they would really like to see me stream on Twitch. And I never thought it would be my thing, but I decided to give it a go because, can't knock it till you try it. So I started streaming in May of last year, along with occasionally still posting videos. I have videos in the works for those of you who watch me from YouTube. I promise I've not forgotten about YouTube. I still do the things. So that's kind of my story. Right now, most of it is a mixture of YouTube and streaming on Twitch 3 times a week. I'm very passionate about science communication. I'm very passionate about that kind of fuzzy feeling that you get when you learn something new and what seems like a complicated concept like just finally clicks and you make the connection, or you learn something new and fun. That has always been the emotion that I've been chasing and that I guess that I want to convey with the things that I do online.
And you absolutely convey it. It's really cool to see your passion shine through in multiple different ways, where you explain about like complex biological phenomena, but also like using Pokemon sometimes, right? So making it really accessible to a wide audience. I mean, that's, I feel like, the sign of a really good science communicator, and you absolutely do that. What originally got you into science? Like, what was it? Like, when did you know what? I really enjoy the sciences, and that's what I want to get into.
I have always loved learning. When I was very, very little, I remember I had this little flip book that I made, and it had 11 pages. And on each one, I drew like the random professions that I wish I could be when I was older, if I could live infinite lives. So I remember I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be a builder because I thought if I were a construction worker, I would have all of the knowledge of being an architect and being able to put that into practice and like build houses for people. So I remember that was a random thing I wanted to do. I wanted to be a spy because it sounded fun to like understand people and learn about things. But I also always loved insects. I remember being in kindergarten, and during the break time, we would go out and there was a fake lawn, and I would always like peel it back and I would look at the woodlice and the earthworms and the giant ants. And I just always thought they were really cool. Like, I remember noticing ants' jaws. And I was like, oh, they look so different to ours, but I can tell what it's doing. And ants are so cool. And then I would read about ants in the encyclopedia at home, because I was a bullied nerd at school, so I spent a lot of time at home reading encyclopedias and books about animals. And I just fell in love with insects. I have always, I mean, maybe it's a very biased thing for me to say, but I think insects should be everyone's favorite animal class just by virtue of the fact there's so many of them. You pick an animal at random, it's probably going to be an insect. And they have so many cool adaptations, such interesting and fascinating life histories. I could just never get enough of insects, and I always knew that I would want to devote myself to entomology in some way. And then as I got a little bit older, I actually suddenly became like a random prodigy in mathematics in my city. So I thought I was going to be a mathematician. Everyone was gunning for me to study math and change the world through math. But then I saw the course of biological sciences at Oxford and how they talked about their entomology course, and just everything sounded great. I was like, if someone were to design a course that was for me and that I would just truly enjoy learning every step of the way, that was it. I never thought I would get it. So I guess something maybe I should have mentioned in my introduction. I am actually from Spain. Hablo español. Soy 100% española. I'm completely bilingual in both languages. But in Spain, it's not very common that leave the country to study elsewhere. You don't really have like those big dreams. It's not really a thing that we grow up with. I apparently was the first girl from my region to study at Oxford, and I, I'm extremely proud because I got into the university to study the subject I was most passionate about. And truly, from start to finish, I mean, it was tough. It was not an easy course at all, but I loved everything about it. And it really felt like a life changing opportunity that just, changed everything about my life. I finally got to go somewhere where learning was encouraged, where learning new things and being passionate about it was rewarded, and where I got to truly just like indulge in my most intellectual and academic passions. So that's what made me pursue insects. And also, I mean, bugs are cool. I don't know if you can see it or not because I know I'm cropped out here, but the mantis is my favorite insect of all times. There are always mantises hidden everywhere in my streams. The like little lights in the background right now, you can't really tell very well, but they're in the shape of a mantis head that I made. So I just love bugs. You can ask me about any bug, and I'll probably have lots of fun things to say about them.
Why mantises?
I know it's International Women's Month, and everyone thinks it's because they chop heads off. Uh, and they do have very fun and captivating life histories. But above all, I just think they're beautiful. They're one of the more, maybe I'm biased, I think they're very beautiful insects. They have the most incredible camouflage. Not only do they have, the physical camouflage, like orchid mantis it looks exactly like a flower. The European mantis, depending on where its last stage. So Mantises are born as like little miniature versions of themselves. They're nymphs. They don't go through an entire uh, metamorphosis. They're born as miniature versions of themselves, but without wings and without the ability to reproduce. In that final molt, depending on the color of the background that they're on, whether it's dry grass or fresh grass, that will determine if they're going to be bright green or if they are going to be bright yellow or a drab brown. So they have very interesting camouflage physically, but also they have behavioral camouflage. They actually sway to imitate as if they're the wind. They will hide and be angled in positions that they look like leaves and twigs poking out of the branch that they're sitting on. And they're ambush predators, and also they have the most gorgeous eyes. And another one of my huge passions is animal vision. On my YouTube channel, there are so many videos about how animals see the world and perception, just because I think for humans, it's one of our main senses that we have, and it's one of the ones that's most relatable and yet most fascinating to sort of try and depict how other organisms see the world. So that's probably why mantises. And also I got to keep one as a pet once. And again, my little 8-year-old self just had like the biggest eyes as to how cool they were. And I would catch bugs so I could feed my mantis. And I was so excited to see if it would ever lay an ootheca. It did not. But yeah, I love mantises.
So that's really cool that you were able to go through like as a kid and it was fostered a love for insects and the world around you because that's not always a usual kind of upbringing, right? Like sometimes like, oh, don't play with bugs. Like I remember also like that image that you gave of like pulling up the grasses and seeing what's underneath. I'm like, oh yeah, I did that too. And it was just like my parents were like, hey, stop doing that. Like that don't do that. But it's really cool that that was supported throughout your childhood and you're able to make that into like pursue it in education as well.
I am extremely grateful to my parents for always being extremely supportive of that. I know that on the one hand, they never wanted me to have a pet like a cat or a dog because we didn't have the space at home. So I think they were just like, "Oh, thank God she loves bugs. They fit in a terrarium. We're very happy to do that." Oh, okay, yeah, she's a bit of a nerdy weirdo, but she's not doing drugs or hanging out with the wrong people. So you know what? We're gonna foster the bug thing. Life could be way worse than just a girl loving her bugs. So I'm very grateful that they were always very supportive and encouraging of me loving the natural world. I mean, my parents also loved the natural world. They would give me lots of books about, learning about nature, how to survive in nature if you're going to be camping for a few weeks, or you're going to be stuck in a natural disaster and you have to fend for yourself. So they get me all sorts of books that had this information. They would buy me terrariums for my birthday. Again, I know that a lot of it was it's a lot more convenient for your kid to be into tiny little bugs than wanting a slightly more challenging pet. But I also love that my parents always valued education. They always valued learning, and they never forced anything on me. It was never, oh, you should be more interested in this type of science or this discipline. Because I'm not saying that there was this at my school. My school was also very dedicated to learning, but I definitely had a lot of, oh, you're a girl. That's very weird that you like insects. Or, there are other disciplines that are better than biology that people should be devoting their time and energy to. So I'm grateful that people just let me be the weirdo who loved her bugs and still loves them to this day.
So for a little bit of a difference in the education system over in Europe. So when you went to take that entomology course, was that the equivalent of an undergrad course or was that already the doctorate when that started?
So this would have been my undergraduate. The actual amusing thing is the course actually changed the year that I joined. So actually it ended up not really being that entomology centric, but by then I had already gotten into Oxford, and I mean everything about the course was really exciting to me, even if there wasn't like explicitly an entomology course. So it was more reading about it was what became the gateway that I decided it was something I wanted to try applying for. It truly felt like something that I wouldn't get. Like I knew the odds of getting into such a university were next to none, and no one from my region in Spain had ever been accepted into no woman, sorry, no woman from my region in Spain had ever been accepted into Oxford. I was the first girl from my school to get into Oxford. I remember filling out the application, and my school just wasn't on the list. Like I had to sort of make a very manual application and reference, and I knew nothing about the application system. It's completely different in Spain to how it is in the UK to how it is in any other country. So I pretty much went in with, no expectations, but hey, if it works out, it would be great. And I got very lucky, and it worked out.
So you had the entomology course. What did you have any research experience in undergrad? And then what kind of drove you towards wanting to pursue a doctorate in insects?
Okay. Uh, so the other thing you need to know, I started my undergraduate at 17. I skipped a grade at school. I started out very young. I knew I wanted, to pursue higher education. But in many ways, I was definitely a very naive kid. I didn't know what a lot of things were. I'm very embarrassed to say that I only learned what a PhD actually was like 2 months before applying for one. I knew it was like an intermediary step to pursue tenure or higher research positions, and that is no longer something that I want to do. It was actually during undergraduate and PhD that I realized I was a lot more passionate about science communication and other other paths than like formally pursuing research. But I didn't really know what it was. I was 19, and all I knew is that I didn't really know what I wanted with my future. I wasn't sure what kind of job I would apply for. So at the time, it definitely felt like I definitely want to keep on learning, and doing a PhD and buying a little bit more time and being paid to research and learn more just sounded like the best option. I knew that I didn't necessarily want to pursue a postdoc afterwards or tenure, and that generally most people pursue a PhD in order to follow the academic track. Uh, although I think there's increasing numbers of people who then sort of jump off the academic wagon afterwards. And given that the number of places available for professors, etc., versus number of people coming in and studying is lower, I think it should be encouraged and made okay that people do want to pursue other things with their education after completing a PhD. So I feel like I truly bumbled into doing a PhD, but I don't regret it. Like there were many times where it was like, what if I gotten myself into? I did do a little bit of research in undergraduate, and my project was in animal flight. And I remembered thinking, the day I handed it in was the day that the biomechanics portion of the course started. And I remembered thinking, wow, if I'd had this during my research project, this would have gone so much better for me. And I remembered thinking, like, I am not studying anything that I don't understand again, because that was very rough research. Like, I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know if I was doing things properly or rigorously. And then I somehow got one of the highest marks in research. Truly, I think it's probably because no one understands it because it's engineering and everyone else was a biologist. But I guess then I was like, okay, well, maybe I can research this at the PhD level because then I get to play with bugs and cameras, which are two of my favorite passions. And I guess we'll figure out the other difficulties along the way.
So, do you
Which
think that that expertise in mathematics also predisposed you to being able to have like, because I imagine it's a different kind of thinking as well, right? Like your of how you view the puzzle and like your background in math and your talent for mathematics, did that also help you with that?
I think it definitely did help. One of the one of the unfortunate things about biology is a lot of the math is statistics, which happen to be the like one area of math that I just didn't have much expertise in at all. So, but it definitely did help. Like it made me not shy away from some of the more complicated engineering aspects that came with it. Don't get me wrong, I spent the entire PhD feeling like an imposter and being acutely aware of the gaps, the huge, huge gaps in my engineering knowledge. But it made me enjoy coding. a lot. And engineering, biology, a lot of STEM subjects have a lot of crossover with other disciplines. And I think my love for mathematics definitely helped with me wanting to actively pursue how it intersects with other disciplines and actually want to talk to other departments and kind of figure out other ways that we can incorporate math and coding and machine learning, etc., in the discipline that I was researching at the time.
So, for us who are not in the know, what is insect wing biomechanics and why is it cool?
So let's see. Biomechanics is the study of mechanics of things biological. I always say that I study insect flight kinematics, which is specifically how their body parts move. Because you got aerodynamics, which is how the air moves around an object. I have a very appropriate prop right here. So kinematics is specifically everything that pertains how an animal's body moves, how its wings move, how it interacts with the fluid that is the air or water that is around it. Aerodynamics is more about what the air does. And then there's also a lot of physiology as well, which I did not study, but there are within this field of insect flight biomechanics, there are also people who actually like look at what different nerves do and how they connect to different muscles and how that leads to different alterations in flight. So I was very preoccupied with how flies and bees and locusts move their wings when they are flying and how moving them in different ways leads to them behaving in different ways. That's a very roundabout explanation.
So, that seems like it's something that connects to a lot of different things, right? So, you've got the wings. Were you think looking at the muscle system, the nervous system, all of it? Like, where does like when you're presented with a project, like Dr. Curiosity, soon to be Dr. Curiosity. Here are is a winged bug. Figure out what it's doing. Like, how did you identify like what your research questions should be and where even to like have like the boundaries? Because it is something it feels like could go with huge breadth and depth.
So a lot of what I can try and give an answer. It might be a little bit long, but I'm going to do my best to explain everything and make it as accessible as possible. The modern field of insect flight, I would say, originated in the late 80s, and a lot of early study into insect flight requires you get an insect and you glue it onto something, and then you use lots of high speed cameras to see what they're doing. So you slow down time and you look at how they're moving their wings. One of the biggest criticisms of doing this is, well, if you're taking an organism and you're gluing it to something, how can you say that the way it's behaving when it's glued to something artificial is the same as when it's flying freely in the air? Because we know that animals behave in different ways when they've been experimentally manipulated. So, a lot of the early data that I was collecting was specifically focusing on trying to get insects in free flight. And we had a really cool setup. So when I want my research to sound cool, I say, oh, I use lasers and high speed cameras. And then when I want people to know that my research also had the like sloggy science parts, then I say, yes, I worked in a room with black walls and no windows for 8 hours a day before the sun rose and before the sun set. But we're going to go for the fun part. We're going to say lasers and cameras. So the way we get this to happen, we need a little flight arena. So I remember we had this 1 meter dome, and we'd have things like food so they could take like little pit stops and eat along the way because I mean insects can fly for quite a while without eating and I could talk forever about insect flight. They kind of lose weight live. It's very impressive. They can lose half of their weight in flight.
That's
When
incredible.
we're speaking about bees, and they can carry up to half of their body weight. So those are absolutely phenomenal feats. So with our flies, our technology was essentially we had all of these high-speed cameras. I have a memory climbing up a ladder, setting them up, and then my supervisor saying, "Hey, you know each of these is 20,000 pounds sterling, not pounds weight, but like money." And I was like, "Don't tell me this as I'm teetering on a ladder." And he's like, "It's fine. These cameras are used in car crashes to film how cars crash and crumple from inside the car. So they can take a lot. They can withstand a lot of G's of damage. They can survive an Inés handling it poorly, climbing up a ladder. But I didn't need to know that in that moment. So we have our high-speed cameras. They're all connected together with LAN cables, so they can all be synchronized and triggered at the same time. So how do you get the camera to trigger exactly when you want? Because even though we have this big arena, it's got to be
Mhm.
big enough for an insect to fly freely. But there's only like a very small part of that arena where all of the cameras are focused on the same spot. So we had these like little not invisible, well, invisible to us, infrared lasers that did a little crosshair thing. So when a fly would fly across where both of the lasers are crossed, that would trigger the cameras. And these are cameras that have pre-recording set on them. So they'll basically take like the 3 seconds before the fly hits that point and the 3 seconds afterwards, and then you'd manually trim it to when you see the fly in all of the different points of view. And you'd have this video, you'd have 4 videos of a silhouette of a fly, and then I would put that in MATLAB. I don't know if anyone in chat is familiar with MATLAB. I'm a rare person who actually really loves MATLAB. I don't know why, but I loved coding in MATLAB. What a great program. Words that not many people think.
We've had a previous guest on who was raging against MATLAB. Because
A
primarily
lot
not
of
because
people,
of the possibility of the tool, but the licensing and the pricing behind it.
To be fair, I am no longer a MATLAB user, and it is because I don't have a license anymore, and I definitely can't allow the price that is out, which is a shame. But as a tool, as a student, I loved MATLAB. I loved all of the things that you could do with it, and I'm acutely aware that I'm quite alone in this love of the software. But in MATLAB, would do all of these interesting image processing. So we would essentially, right, I'm going to use a word, photogrammetry. Photogrammetry is essentially knowing where objects, in front of a camera are in space. Because we know exactly where the cameras are and we have these like calibration grids that we made, we are able, having the different perspectives from different cameras, know exactly where a fly is in space, where its wing is, what orientation it's in, what size it is. You can get a lot of information about it.
And so that's giving you kind of baseline
Mm.
measurements to go against, right? That you can standardize all the experiments, right?
Yeah. And because we would have different perspectives, we'd do something called voxelization. So I'm sure you've heard of a pixel. A voxel is basically a pixel with volume. So we would have this cube, and then you have your 4 silhouettes of a fly at each point in time, and you have all of the photogrammetry information from each one. So you can carve out the shape of the fly from all perspectives, and that gives you a 3D model of a fly, which you could represent visually, and it would look something like this. Well, in this case, this is a bee, but imagine a fly. And also basically gave me MATLAB matrices that would last me until literally the end of time. So that was basically turning my bugs into data that I would then research for the rest of time.
And so in this setup, right, would you let loose, I guess, one fly at a time? And it's one of those where they could just fly around in the space. And like you said, at any point they cross that double laser, that's when you're going to be taking the video so they can be exploring, they could do whatever. But what you're interested in is how they fly.
Precisely. And it would look a little bit. So I did a number of different projects, and different ones had different goals. So, I mean, goal number one for everything was just to get high quality free flight data, because this was maybe not the first time, but it was at the time, probably not anymore, the largest data set of free flying insects. Because, if you have an insect that's tethered, sure, you can collect hundreds upon thousands of wing beat information. But when it's flying freely, you're kind of relying on getting lucky and it flying in the exact position that you want it to. So, with our like fancy laser trigger camera setup, in a way, it's a lot like streaming. Like a lot of the way the tech intersected together, it reminds me of streaming, which I think is also why I enjoy streaming so much now. I'm like, oh, it like hits the same spot for me.
All the tech backgrounds, they were like, oh,
Yeah.
we're good. I can run a production studio at this point.
Yeah. So it was the first time that we could use automation to a degree where we were able to collect more of this data. Uh, I'm absolutely certain that there's been way more huger data sets collected since then. Since handing in the PhD, but for a brief period in animal flight history, I probably held that torch, and I will cling on to that with a tiny bit of pride.
How many did you have to record? Like when you're saying like you got all these recordings, presumably you're getting multiple recordings per individual. Do you have a, and I know this is one of those questions you probably not, but like did you go through and just calculate out like how many fruit flies you actually had to go and image?
That information is absolutely in my PhD, and I don't actually remember right now. One of my personal gripes. So I borrowed a data set from my supervisor. That was the biggest data set because he studied hoverflies, and as the name suggests, hoverflies do a lot of hovering. And I was studying flies that do a lot of forwards flight. So they don't hover in the middle for very long. They're like here and gone. So it would take many more iterations to get a workable number of wing beats per individual, let alone for a data set as a whole. So I remember my supervisor said, "Yeah, I collected all of my data in one coffee break. I went out to get coffee and I came back and this hoverfly had just spent its butt in the middle of the flight arena, and that was the data for his PhD." And I was like, "Well, I spent 3 months in a dark room waving my fist at flies, wanting to rename them walks because they would not fly, and waiting to collect enough times where they would pass over the center and devising all of the ways possible to get them to fly and pass through the center." So it was definitely a lot more effort than I expected it to be at the time, and probably for not as impressive a number of wing beats. But it was definitely in the thousands, like 4 digits number
And
of
it's
wing
harder
beats.
too, like you said, in comparison what had been done before, because you're not taking the fruit fly and putting and gluing it to a strand and just forcing it to be in the video, right? You wanted to see unobstructed how does the flight work.
Exactly, yeah.
So and so you had the hoverfly data. Did you look at any other insects, or was it primarily the fruit fly?
So I collected data for fruit flies, I collected data for blowflies, I collected data for bumblebees, and in my undergraduate project, I collected data for locusts, but my locusts were tethered, so those ones weren't free flying.
So that is a lot of data across a lot of different insects. What was your goal? Like what was the big takeaway from your project? What were you looking for?
So the goalposts moved a lot throughout the course of the PhD, as I'm sure everyone with a PhD is familiar. I remember being in my final year and still having a lot of open-ended questions. Like some of the biggest things that I discovered came in that final year as I was typing things out. But um, I'm very happy to talk about it. It's out of embargo. The thesis I think can be read online, so it is out there. So it depended on the insect. With bumblebees, what I was interested in was learning how their flight pattern changes depending on if they're carrying weight. So bumblebees vary a lot in size. They have a lot of size variation. So there's lots of very tiny individuals, and there are some that are over 10 times that size. And I was curious whether the way they fly and the shape of their wings and the way their wing moves, whether that was affected by their size, and also whether it was affected by how much weight they carried. So I attached ball bearings using, very ironically, beeswax onto them. And I would measure how much the bee weighed at the start and the end of the experiment and how much its little weight would weigh. And I have all of these cool videos where they look like they're wearing little backpacks. There is some videos on my YouTube channel, if anyone is curious. There's one called Why Bumblebees Squirt and How It Controls Their Life. Because I managed to get a slow motion video of a bumblebee squirting on camera. And
What is that?
so if you disturb a bunch of bumblebees, you might notice that some of them will squirt. I don't want to spoil the video, but it is their way of peeing, and bumblebees are very good at not losing water. A lot of insects, so as you know, insects don't have lungs, they have spiracles, which are little holes in their cuticle. They lose a lot of water by just the way they passively breathe. They have a lot of surface area whereby they can say bye bye to water. So most insects don't pee. Uh, Bumblebees have interesting physiology that allows them to be extra good at holding onto the water that they have, which is especially important if you're flying around and doing a lot of things, because as you lose water, you lose water weight, and if you put a bee on a pair of scales, you'll observe the weight go down in real time. So because they are actually so good at not losing water weight, all things considered, sometimes if they want to shed weight so they can fly faster because they feel threatened, they will just pee and they will just squirt in that moment. So that's why they do it. Usually it means I've disturbed them and they were not expecting me.
That is really cool. And also, like you were mentioning too, that as you're measuring their flight, they're changing their weight. Like
Yeah.
that, and then you're able to measure that like before and after. That is incredible that you're able to see that phenomena of like, and also just the imagery of putting on like a metal backpack onto the bumblebee is that's just such a
I
cool
always
visual.
I always feel so bad because you have to. There are different ways of anesthetizing an insect in order to do that, and in the literature, a lot of people generally prefer. There's two options. Sorry, for anyone who's never done this, there are two main ways that we sort of uh, temporarily freeze an insect so that we can do things to it. One of them is you can just put them on top of cold. They enter this phenomenon known as a chill coma or a cold coma. So if you put them in the fridge for a little while, they're just kind of very lethargic and they won't be able to do very much. They'll be a little bit floppy. If you put them in a freezer for too long, they will pass away. So you have to keep the temperature control, manage it carefully, and be quick. The other option, you can have one of these big tanks of CO2, and you can essentially sort of asphyxiate them. So if there's too much CO2, they're not able to get enough oxygen, so they're not really able to move around, and they also enter a similar coma. But there's evidence in the literature that the CO2 version can sort of cause muscular damage in insects because they are basically being suffocated. So I remember not wanting to do that, because if the whole purpose of conducting a free flight experiment is you're not tethering them, so you're not tampering with how they behave. If I then go and use CO2 that causes damage to their tissues, then I'm also going to introduce, uh, artifacts, and also, I want the bug to do well. I don't want the bug to suffer. Um, or, I don't want to change its ability to fly. So I went down the cold route, which they don't behave as well, and you have to be very careful and quick before they like completely wake up. Um, but that was the method that I chose, and then we measure them. We measure the weight before and afterwards, because then you can like plot a regression curve, and depending on what time your recording is, you can estimate how much the bee weighed at that point in time. So you can have like high quality data that's being predicted for each possible point.
Does that mean that you can decide or identify what the rate of, I guess, weight loss is within the bee, like over the course of flying?
Yeah. Oh, and Smikes asked, how do we weigh a bee? So I forget, I forget the precise name of these scales, but there would be very, very, very high tech scales, the sort that they are on, non-vibration surfaces, and you open a little door, you sort of tear it in advance, you put the bee inside and close it, and you find out the milligrams and the micrograms and the nanograms, and it will give you like a string of 15 numbers, and you can see them like fluctuating and going down in real time. So it put the bee in for about 10 seconds and essentially just take the average of the values that we saw. And that would be how we measured the bee. And I would also measure them before and after putting the ball bearing on. So I would also know how much the ball bearing and the beeswax weighed when added onto it. And then we would look at how their flight pattern would change, if at all. And I remember writing this extremely convoluted image processing coding thing in MATLAB so that all of the photos of their wings, I would be able to essentially know where all of the different wing veins were and what the proportion of their wings were, and if that correlated in any way with their body size and with certain ways that they flew. This actually never made it into my thesis. This was like a little mini project that I did at the very, very start. But I loved my bees so much that everyone thinks my PhD is on bees. But I loved working with bumblebees.
How, so like, when you're working with all these different types of insects, did you have to learn like even how to take care of them on a day-to-day basis? Like, did you have cultures of each one of these
Yeah,
animals?
I did. Oh my god. I did. Sorry, I'm about to go on the I love bees. So I learned, I did not know this at the time. You can order bees online, and you will be delivered a buzzing box. I must have been the postman for the zoology department at Oxford must, I was gonna say hate me, but just hate us collectively, because that is the most ominous box you can receive. It says live biological organisms inside, and each time you touch it, it buzzes angrily. It's bzzz. So it was so ominous. And I remember my supervisor said, "Your bees have arrived." And I went into the containment lab and I was like, "Oh my God, they're here." This angrily, it looked quiet at first, then you pick up the box and it starts buzzing. Bzzz. It's all very safe. You open it up and then there's like an actual hive inside, and nothing can come out until you officially take off the red tape and open the doors. And I remembered, I had this little enclosure just for them. I set them up with special sugar water because everything has to be monitored and constant, so we aren't introducing random factors. So I would have this specific recipe using this brand of sugar and water in this proportion and in these feeders with these different colors, and I would sometimes like just change the color of the feeders just to see which color they preferred. So I was running my like micro experiments alongside everything else. Like, I wonder which one they like more. So I did get to take care of them similarly with with the flies as well. With the fruit flies, as I'm sure you're familiar, they would be in their vials in a temperature controlled room that was just exclusively devoted to raising fruit flies. And then for the blowflies, they had the best life they ate better than me. as a PhD student, we would buy steak. These little flies, make no mistake, they would get steak from us. So for the maggots, they would get the best premium Tesco steak, and then when they became flies, we would get, I think it was like baby formula and mashed banana. To be fair, I don't like banana, so I really hated mixing that up. And I would sometimes do a deal with my other colleagues who were also researching them. I would do the carry-on and the steaks and the maggots because I wasn't squeamish about that, but they could do the banana. They could do the banana for the flies because I didn't like the smell of that. So there was definitely a lot of taking care of them. Fruit flies were the most finicky. I remember having to get up very early
Really?
to take
I
care.
would have thought it would have been the blowflies because it's like all the different diets to account for. That's interesting.
When you were studying fruit flies,
Mhm.
and I'm gonna say a series of words that are gonna sound terrible out of context. But did you have to farm virgins?
I farmed so many virgins left, right, and center.
Okay. Okay, good.
For those wondering in the chat, when you're doing these genetic crosses, right, you want to make sure that the female's unmated so that you know exactly where all of the sperm is coming from one genetic background to another. And that does mean you have to, clear out vials and go in early and try to find them.
So my second, I told you about my bumblebee project. My fruit fly one. I actually think the fruit fly one was one of the more interesting ones biologically, because as I'm sure as I know you've talked about many times, there's very interesting sexual selection. I mean, all across the board in biology, but like specifically also in fruit flies as well. And then being a model organism, there's so much that we study. So the research project that I was working on, there had been a series of genetically modified accidental pun, genetically modified flies where they had changed the aspect ratio of their wings. So very quickly, for anyone who doesn't know, aspect ratio is, if you were to define a wing as a rectangle, such a physicist thing to say, the larger the aspect ratio, the more elongated the wing is, because one of their dimensions is a lot bigger than the other one. So your wild type fruit fly has very stout, round wings, and these genetically modified ones had slightly more elongated ones. And the interesting thing is actually the longer your wings are, the more maneuverable you are, and you're a lot more agile, and they're kind of better at flying. So if they're being pursued by a predator, they can turn faster. So some would expect that natural selection would call for longer wings when it comes to fruit flies, but that's not what we observe. And so I came in to actually do the sexual selection side of that. So we know that they probably fly better with these longer wings. So I was like, okay, well, there's one other thing nature loves to select for, and that is, do they have the Riz? And they do. And so I remember I took 400 vials of genetically modified flies on the train to St. Andrews in Scotland, where there was a research group that has the smallest microphone in the world, which they used to listen to insects. So I got to play Big Brother with my fruit flies. I would harvest the virgins, and then I would put the virgins with the males, and I would record them with the microphone, and I would listen to see what they sounded like. And then I performed all of this like auditory analysis on the sounds they produce with their wings. And basically, they just sound sexier when they have the stouter wings. They're able to generate a louder sound, which is more appealing to the females, and therefore they're then much more likely to mate with them. So then you get a generation with stouter wings. And I guess also these were all laboratory flies, so obviously there's also no predators there. In fact, I my biggest pet peeve as a flight person is all of these like laboratory lines. They're so terrible at flying. No one's giving these flies any exercise. They don't fly. They have nowhere to go in the vials. So half the time they don't fly anyway, even when they're supposed to. So truly, maybe wild type flies have slightly more elongated wings, but
But it's all a
it was
continuum,
still
right? Like you were able to listen in and hear the song. That's more attractive to the female, so that's the one they prefer. I mean, and we were actually talking about it before, where some of those flies, right, have been in generation wise since the early 1900s for your wild type into that tube. So who knows, like, how long since it's been since they had a pressure to really go out and take a flight.
precisely. I can do a rendition of what they sound like. Fruit flies do two things. They make a sine song, which is like, which is very sine wave, and that is apparently the most attractive thing. If you nail the right pitch with your sine song, you're in. And then the other thing they do is a train song, where they try and make loud type sounds with their wings for as long as possible. And if they're able to do that for a bit longer, I guess it just shows a little bit more bravado, and they also like that. But if they're unable to produce the perfect sign song, it doesn't matter, because that's if they don't hear that, they're not interested. It's like the sign song is the this is a male who wants to copulate, and then after that the train is like, and I'm stronger than this other guy.
So there's almost an order of operations, right? Of like what's like this is the sign song that I really want to hear, and if you're really good at this other stuff, right, that's how I'll filter you even further.
Exactly.
That's
And I
really cool.
remember,
Sorry, go ahead.
oh no, I'm sorry, you're good. I was just saying, I remember we just had to like not only listen to them, but also I would have all of the vials lined up, and I would have to write down what time each male started mating and what time they ended, which led to many questions at meetings, such as, and how long did they last? And uh, and some people study like the amount of seminal material that is transferred between them. So when I was in that sexual selection group, just all of the questions at every group meeting would have sounded so terrible out of context. But I really loved that group. I and I love the research that they did. I ended up going to a more like pure biomechanical group, but I did borrow a lot of the knowledge with, fruit flies and their sexual dimorphism, and how the males and the females are slightly different in their wing behavior and wing shape, and how that translates to their flight differences.
You mentioned there was a difference in males' ability to fly like short wings versus the longer wings, and there was quote like better flight. What did you entail like visualize as what better flight means? Like in the data set, like what is a good flyer and what is not?
So this wasn't technically my research. This was more, I read the paper and I guess got to build off from it. I would say at the crux of it, they would be looking at different kinematic parameters. So essentially, no, I can try and explain a little bit more of that. There are different things that you can look at, such as, how fast can a fly go? How quickly can it accelerate? Can it fly backwards? How quickly does it turn? How many wing beats does it take for a fly to react to something and turn? And essentially, the larger the aspect ratio of the wing, the more elongated it is, the faster it's able to turn. So the key difference between the wild type and this genetically modified one is that they could turn slightly faster. In the context of a predator, you do want to be able to turn in order to dodge or, you know, avoid something coming to squish you. So it would confer an advantage there. But obviously, in the context of, a lab fly, we kind of want our flies to survive, so they're not being subjected to a lot of pressure filled environments. But I could imagine that if they were uh wild type, depending on the regions that they lived in, say these are fruit flies that are close to a pond where there's a lot of dragonflies. Dragonflies are very good at plucking insects out of the air. So if some individuals are able to turn faster than others, those ones are much more likely to survive under those circumstances. But I would agree with you, that's a very good question because, what actually is better flight? So really, it was more about seeing what kinematic differences they had.
That and you never subjected them to a predator in this flight arena, right? It was just seeing them fly, crossing the beam, getting that data. You didn't like release like a spider or a dragonfly into there and see like who survives better or not.
I never did anything like that. I think in the paper that was looking at that, they would subject them to looming responses, which is basically, like you move an object towards them and that will usually make them fly. And I mean, to be fair, that's how we got them to fly. I'd have to like brandish these special fly wands, and I tried all sorts of things. Like I'd try fly wands with banana on them to try and attract them to it. I'd just like wave something near them to try and get them to fly. So you could kind of argue that they're flying as if they are escaping a disturbance, but because we're catching them in midair and not when they're taking off, for example, I can't say that they're not reacting to me in real time or reacting to a predator coming towards them. So I didn't do that, and technically we were just trying to capture their natural behaviors as as comes by them, as opposed to just in response to predators.
Right. Yeah. And then so you that was the bee work and the fly and the fruit fly work, and you mentioned there was one more, a carnivorous one that got more delicious steaks than you did.
Yes.
What was the work on that one?
So the blowflies was, I'm going to call it much more theoretical work. So one of the coolest things about blowflies that I didn't know until I started my project. Blowflies, hoverflies have a gear change mechanism. So many of you might know flies diptera, two wings. Their back pair is actually a pair of halteres which act as gyroscopes. They are very, very agile flyers. But blowflies and hoverflies have another trick up their wing or sleeve. Sorry for the pun. Not really. And they have a gear change mechanism. So this kind of blew everyone's minds when they discovered it. Like basically, they have a little piece that can push on in different configurations at the base of their wing. So there was another person, uh, Jonathan Page, who was also one of my colleagues, and he was studying that mechanism. In order to study it, they took tethered blowflies, and they had a camera set up at an angle so that you can see exactly what position the gear change mechanism is in, and then they had another camera to keep track of how the wing is moving, and they were able to find out a plethora of different kinematic parameters and how those correlate with different gear change mechanisms. It's, there's a lot of overlap between the different gear change mechanisms, and there's technically three or four positions depending on the fly. It's either decoupled in position one, position two, and technically there's a position three, but it's very rare for it to be placed like that. So, what I was trying to do, given that we were working with the same batch of blowflies and the same setup otherwise, with his data set, I was trying to see if there was any way of using machine learning that could give us a framework to figure out if from our free fly data, if we could make a prediction on what sort of gear change it was operating in. It was and I say very theoretical chapter, and I have to sort of caveat that there's no actual way of proving if we are right or not. So it was very much presented as a method and something that would be neat to explore if we have a way of being able to discern this in flight to verify it. But that these are two data sets that work very well together because they come from the same batch. And the answer kind of was the data does cluster in ways that would suggest that we could probably take a good guess at how they are flowing through different gear change mechanisms. But again, much like everything in PhDs, it was like a, and this will be an interesting stepping stone
Yeah.
for a future PhD student to cry about. But here was the idea that we had.
That is incredible about the gear change mechanism and like visualizing then like in free flight, like maybe like trying to link to how the flying moves with certain gear changes. I didn't realize that about blowflies. That's really cool. Also, it's interesting that they were carnivorous, that you had to work with snakes. Were those all the insects that you worked on during their PhD?
I guess technically I worked on the hoverfly dataset, but I didn't get to play with a hoverfly myself. Although, and again, I'll be plugging my YouTube again, but there is a video called "The Psychology of Mimicry," which focuses a lot on the difference between hoverflies and bees and wasps, and it then goes on to be entirely about the psychological aspect of animals and how they determine if something's a threat or not. But those were the same hoverflies that the data sets I was working with had come from. Like they had been pinched from Port Meadows in Oxford and the university parks just outside. And they'd been snuck into the flight arena. He had collected the data during his coffee break. And in some ways, I always thought maybe I should have just found my blowflies in the wild, because at least then I know that they fly well. As opposed to ones that you buy from a pet store, which are kind of have been bred to be eaten. Therefore, they don't fly very much.
So I think that's the perfect seg because you mentioned one thing that you got really, really passionate about during your time in graduate school was also science communication. And presumably, is that when the YouTube presentation started? How did you get into science communication and why? What motivated you as like, you know what, this is something that's important that I really need to focus on?
So I've always believed that, people do better at their jobs when they're doing something that they're good at and that they enjoy doing. I think that anything someone does, it's not just about providing value to everybody else, but it's, also got to be something that's fulfilling for one's self. And I have always loved documentaries, and this in Spain, there's this canal, La Dos, which is the documentary channel. And everyone just always talks about that channel as the channel that they put on to fall asleep to. Like, they'll put it on and it's boring and they'll have their siesta and it kind of looks good because it looks like you're learning something. But the stereotype is that it's boring. And that's always kind of made me very sad. And I always sort of had the dream of I would love to make documentaries or explainer things, but where it's fun, like where people go and they're excited and they know they're going to walk away feeling like, oh, I got to understand that cool thing where I learned something new. And again, that's just a feeling that I love, that I feel is universally positive and non-problematic, and I guess is just sort of what I've always strived for in what I made. And I also knew it was something, my dream was to be like a science presenter, to get to be the face that explains fun things, so I get to see people, having this moment of their own. So at the time, it was both. I had extra time during my PhD, and it really felt like if I don't try it now, if I have a 9 to 5 job, I'm not going to have the energy to do this afterwards. And I'm in a very fantastic position where I get to go to conferences, I get to learn about other people's research. I'm like hands on with the science, one degree of freedom away from everybody else's research. I hear a lot of conference papers where, the, the jargon and the language sounds very boring and it's not very accessible. But I'm like, this person is doing super cool work and I would love more people to know about it. So that's how it started. And I was also very scared at the time that I wouldn't be good at it or that I wouldn't enjoy doing it. So I just figured I'll do it when it's low stakes. So if I fail, then at least I tried. It's kind of like Twitch. I didn't think I would be good at it, but I wanted to give it a go so I could say that I tried. Don't knock it until you try it. And it was also at a time, every PhD student goes through that slump where even if you're working on your absolute passion project, like I love bugs hyperbolically. I love cameras hyperbolically. Every single aspect of my PhD were things that I loved. And even I had like a stretch of months where I just kind of wished I wasn't doing my PhD. I was like, why am I doing this? Is my work making a difference? Am I ever going to get anywhere with this? Am I just wasting time? And to be able to rediscover all of the things that made me exciting about learning and pursuing this field was something that I found when going into science communication, because I, sort of got to touch base again with like, oh, this is like a really exciting thing that someone's discovered, and I get to talk about it and reframe it. And I don't know, I feel like it was, I don't want to call it a distraction from my PhD, but I feel like it worked very well alongside it for me to become a little bit less cynical again. So I started in 2016 uh, when I was halfway through my PhD.
And what kept you with it? Like what about it when you were going through it, like you said, you're trying it out, you're having the opportunity to do this. You haven't had the opportunity before, you got a little downtime. What was that moment, or was there a moment where you're like, this is it?
I think it was just realizing that a lot of the things I was scared about, because I was just, I've never felt like I'm the most eloquent person. I'm not someone who thinks in words. I generally think in images, and I kind of always have to translate from concepts and pictures into words. So I always worried that I wouldn't be verbally a good presenter because I'd be sort of stuttering and umming and ahhing to figure out the best way to say something in English or in Spanish. But practice makes perfect. And giving talks, making videos. Obviously, when I watch my earliest videos, like I cringe a lot. I'm not a very good presenter, to be perfectly honest. Like the subject's cool. I could have presented it better. I think I'm a lot more relaxed about how I present things now, and I don't have the tired PhD face, and I have a better sense of humor now, and all that. So I think realizing that I did actually genuinely really enjoy it was what helped me stick with it. I was like, I'm so glad I started. I wish I'd started sooner, but don't we all?
Yeah, at least you started. You're able to pursue something that you're really good at, and that you really, I mean, I'm gonna speak on behalf of the entire audience that you're very, very eloquent at, and you are very, very, very good at it. Like I said, we've watched your videos even before we knew you as a Twitch streamer. It was like, this is accessible, this is easy to digest, and it's not in any way talking down to the audience. It's making something digestible and accessible to a large audience that is not an easy topic. And so you're dang good at it. Can you tell us how did that be get parlayed into Twitch, and what are future plans for Dr. Inés?
So I did end up taking a very long break from YouTube. There were like a variety of factors that went into that. Truthfully, I did end up very burnt out post PhD. I could talk a lot about undiagnosed ADHD, but essentially at the crux of it, when I handed in, I realized that the way I got things done in the past was deadline, deadline, panic, deadline, and nothing fuels me like fear and a deadline. But I also kind of realized, I'm pulling a lot of all-nighters. The anxiety isn't good. There's always a fallout when you're really anxious and high stress about something. And I kind of, I made a bit of a promise to myself that I didn't want to be anxious about my work in the future, or at least not, you know, with the regularity that my PhD would bring, where like every other week I'd have to pull an all-nighter for some reason or another. I feel, giving myself that permission and treating the anxiety aspect, I then, was confronted with the burnout of just working at full steam on a PhD in science communication for multiple years and removing the thing that apparently motivated me to get things done, which was anxiety. I just suddenly was like, wow, I have no motivation and clearly a lot of things I need to work on that I've been ignoring for a long time. So that was part of the. I remember thinking, I worked very hard doing the PhD and doing YouTube, so I saved up a lot at the time from that. And I remember I was going to treat myself to a sabbatical. I moved to Malaysia and, all I wanted to do was be in nature, learn how to dance, learn new languages. I learned Malay, I learned a bit of Mandarin, and I just kind of wanted to spend time doing all the things I didn't get to do during my PhD because I was so focused on academia and working. And then the pandemic hit. So, like, my sabbatical got cut short by the pandemic,
Did you get to
by
go
2020.
but you at least you got to go to Malaysia and experience it
Oh, yeah.
some? Okay.
I did, and I really loved it there. I then moved to Singapore and was there for a year. In Singapore, the visa I was on did not allow uh, to do journalism, and YouTube could have been considered journalism. And I didn't want to get into trouble, so I just kind of laid low. And then I moved to the US, and under the visa that I'm on, you have to apply and pay to get the right to work. And because of the pandemic, it was extremely backlogged and it took so many months to get my permit, like my right to work. Took a very long time to come through. So, kind of all of that compounded together. Then I had health issues. So, I just ended up taking a very long, indefinite break from making things because, I kind of made this promise, mental health and physical health are going to come first. We have to take care of ourselves. You know, I love my work and I want to believe my work is important, but I don't think it's that important that I need to run myself into the ground for it. So I did a lot of other, little jobs, but wasn't on the internet for a long time. But then last year, I was like, I want to come back. I feel like if I don't come back now, I just never will. So I decided I was going to return to YouTube. I've had quite a few people who had messaged me like multiple times over the years, as well as my husband have all kind of said, Inés, why don't you stream? We'd love to see you stream sometime. I think you'd be really good at streaming. And I never thought I would be because I used to be really nervous about live streams and answering questions live. Because again, all of the oh, am I eloquent? Can I translate things on the spot quickly enough to convey this? And I'm a big perfectionist when it comes to my YouTube videos. Like I like everything to be clean and seamless. I'd like to use it as a portfolio. Like I'm a good presenter. I can edit things. I can put together like a little mini show. So, there are some things that are rough around the edges, but I'm always, trying to get like a polished product. So live streaming just felt very daunting in that way. So I tried it in a very low stakes manner. It was going to be a co-working stream. I was going to work on my videos when I went live, and that was it. But then I really enjoyed the chit chatty part, and everyone's actually really sweet on Twitch, and I could establish a lot of comparisons between culture on YouTube versus culture on Twitch. And one thing that Twitch really, really, really excels at is excellent community, excellent community culture, and excellent moderation tools. So I was just always very afraid that, the kind of typical trolls that you get in your comments were gonna appear on Twitch. But actually everyone's really well behaved and sweet and supportive of the person who's going live. And that was something that I found very touching. And also I'm an extrovert and it kind of scratched a big extrovert itch that I had in a way that I wasn't expecting. So that's how I ended up streaming and how it ended up not being a co-working stream. My bio is a lie. It is not where Dr. Inés goes to work on her videos. It's where Dr. Inés goes to not work on her videos now.
Well, it's a little, you could always frame it. It's research for the next one. You're field testing to see how people are going to respond to certain topics. Speaking of, you had a really cool tier list the other week as well that like pushing the innovation of what exactly it means to be doing the stream. It's not just a chat, right? It's like there's these interactive topics, there's tier lists, there's Pokemon cards coming into play. So it's pulling in, it's getting a different itch, if you will, on that science communication front. Has there been a big highlight that you can tell us about, like event wise or a topic you've covered?
Been there have been so many fun things on Twitch. Like what you say, I think is also one of the things I love. When I first joined Twitch, I didn't really understand Twitch, and I still don't feel like I understand it. But I know I like it here. Is what I mean to say. But I think it kind of I think it's an integral part of Twitch. Like you can just kind of make of it what you want. Like everybody's stream has its own vibe and feeling. And one of the biggest things that a lot of creators talk about on YouTube, and especially women creators, because again, and we don't have to, talk about like the difference in comment sections between male creators and female creators, etc. But it is something that's usually on my mind. It's something that we talk about a lot. And something that is always very important is fostering community, avoiding having trolls, and something I've spent a lot of time thinking about like throughout the course of my life, and not even just in the context of making content on the internet, but even in real life. Like what makes a community healthy? What makes a group of people that comes together and wants to spend time together? What's the sign of a healthy community? And it's usually, diversity, the presence from people from marginalized community, people being listened to, kindness, thoughtfulness. Because again, I always say like everyone in my audience is extremely smart, but you can be smart and an asshole. Uh, what I love is that everyone is smart and everyone is kind, and I've seen this as a quote, and I genuinely believe it and stand by it. But usually, the kindest person in the room is often also the smartest person in the room. And so, I don't know. There's been something about Twitch where I've like actually been able to see like, wow, there are a lot of very kind people. And how do we build communities that have those kind people in them? And not even like in my community, but like when I come to yours, there's always a bunch of sweeties. A lot of the people who raid into you that I have also seen their streams, I'm like, yeah, like the people who are there are thoughtful. They have nice, thoughtful ideas that they share. And how do you build that? And I don't know. That's like one of my personal like sociological questions that keep me up at night. And I feel like Twitch is providing me with more answers to that than other platforms that I have been on. So that's a very nebulous thing, but in an overarching way, that's what keeps me on the platform. And when I think about Twitch, I'm like, that's what I think about.
So as we're rounding out our discussion, because I want to make sure we don't keep you too late and we got to keep your voice intact for tomorrow. One question that we've been asking all of our guests who've been on and that we'd like to ask you as well is, what does it mean to you to be a woman in STEM?
This is always a very tricky question. So, well, if I'm like being super super honest, I will take a very long time to describe. Um, so I've never felt very strongly about my gender, which might come as a bit of a surprise because I know they present very feminine. But I've generally always felt, I'm probably, I don't know, non-binary, agender. I don't know. I've never felt when I think of myself or like describe what I do, it always strikes me when other people like use something gendered to describe it. It doesn't come naturally to me. So from an internal perspective, I feel like I'm very head empty, no thoughts about it. But definitely as someone who presents very femininely and, you know, read as a woman, etc. Uh, I definitely do notice that sometimes I get treated differently than my peers. This has definitely happened. Ironically, it did not happen so much at Oxford, but since I left Oxford, I have noticed that if people don't know that I have a PhD, I'm a lot more likely to be spoken down to. I'm a lot more likely to experience people who just kind of assume that I don't know how to code or I don't know, you know, basic scientific concepts. Uh, Another thing, and this is an interesting intersection with science, and that I definitely notice in my YouTube comment section from time to time. There is this phenomenon where you can't be good at science if you look good or if you put effort into your appearance. It's almost a dichotomy where if you try to be put together or you wear makeup or you put effort into your hair in any way or you like wear nice clothes, then that must be absolutely at the expense of any possible character points that you could have assigned to being a good scientist or being smart or being a good researcher. And that is something that I definitely notice in a series of ways. Like, for example, on YouTube, I'll get comments from people who just kind of assume I'm reading a script that someone else wrote. You know, they're like, "Oh, why? You know, why is she presenting, and not the person who wrote the script, or she's just parroting words and she doesn't know what they mean." Where I'm like, "No, I wrote this. These were my ideas, actually." And I don't really see that with maybe not male scientists, but more male science communicators. In fact, I almost see it the other way around. It's almost if you're, you know, something about being a man and suddenly you're tall or like considered attractive, then they also automatically have this halo effect where it automatically means they must be a better presenter or science communicator. And I definitely get a lot. I definitely sort of notice those patterns. And I think that's almost part of the reason that I like to try and be a little bit more put together on Twitch. I mean, part of it is just like the ritual of like getting ready gets me in the headspace of, hey, we're gonna do smart things. But also to try and challenge that view because at least on Twitch everything is live. So, you know, I'm probably not reading a script from somewhere else, and if I am, I probably wrote it myself. So I don't this is not exactly like what is it like to be a woman in STEM and maybe more a woman in science communication. But I think those are the things that generally, you know, come to mind to me when I end up being reminded of my gender or you know how people perceive me. I sometimes find myself remembering that sometimes people just kind of assume that I'm probably not very competent, and also in a very minor way. But sometimes I check out new streams in game and software development, and until they find out that I'm a woman, a lot of people, like in chat, they'll just refer to me as bro. Like they just assume that someone who's like deliberately seeking out knowledge on this platform uh, is probably not a woman. And again, this ties into a lot of things that I often, you know, think about in my own time about YouTube and you know who the algorithm serves content to and who people expect to be watching content versus not. And I guess it makes me realize that people aren't really expecting women to engage with educational content, even though you know I don't think there's anything gendered about wanting to learn things. Uh, and satisfy one's curiosity about things.
So, how does it feel then to be a pioneer? Right? To challenge the advocacy of this, to be able to go in there and just tear apart this patriarchy and be like, you know what? I'm gonna put on makeup. I'm gonna be like this put together look, and I'm gonna teach y'all everything that you need to know about this topic. Because that's something that we've talked about here too. Lita's our professor in grad school told us many times that scientists don't wear makeup. That was a common statement that he would make to many of the female students in the lab, right? And it was one of those like you think you're so aware and you're welcoming, but you're actually gatekeeping when you're doing something like
Yeah.
this. So, how does it feel then to be a pioneer it basically that's what you are, right? You're a pioneer as a woman in science, breaking down some of these barriers. How does that feel?
I feel like I always feel like I'm a very, very small little creator, so I don't know. But I know that part of the reason I do it is I'm like, okay, if anyone does challenge that, I mean, I have my credentials. I've put in the work. Um, I know that, the science and the knowledge of how to be rigorous didn't drop out of my brain because I decided that I was going to dress up a little bit before stream. So I guess maybe there is a little bit of quiet confidence from knowing, well, I know what I have accomplished, and I also know what I haven't accomplished. So it's one of those things where if and when it does crop up, then I have the opportunity to say, well, I do have a degree from Oxford, and I do have a PhD. It's not usually the sort of thing that I would bring up otherwise, um, but I do think it's good representation in that sense that you know putting effort into one thing doesn't mean that you're not putting effort into you know other aspects of your knowledge or expertise. And I know that I'm definitely very, very passionate about science communication and, teaching people fun things in a fun way. And I've been told that that curiosity can be quite infectious. So it's something that I definitely don't want to stop doing. And as we always say, representation is always important. And there are plenty of, this is maybe more specific to YouTube, but it took a very long time for the first woman creator to reach 1 million subscribers, although by that point there were dozens of men who created educational content who had reached a similarly sized audience. And I think just being able to see that there are competent creators of all sorts of backgrounds, and not just gender, but skin color, background, um, even origins. Some of the best science communicators I know actually aren't scientists. Some of them are artists or have found their way, into, I don't know, I don't know what to say, the industry, but into the space, through very different routes. And I think having that diversely represented is important. Like it's definitely scary when you don't see, any women with large audiences who teach things, or why are all the big creators on YouTube white, when there are a lot of very fantastic black science communicators. So in that sense I do think representation is important. And I never want to be like the token woman or whatever, but I definitely am happy to represent and challenge any prejudices that anyone may have.
And thank you for doing so. I like again, we are huge fans of you here. I love that, you're not gonna step down when someone comes in and be like, "Oh, what are you talking about? Looky here. This is a PhD from Oxford. All right. I have this insect wing biomechanics under my belt, and not only that, I am dang good at being able to communicate what is the science behind this. And you are really, really good at doing all of those things. And thank you for being a pioneer, for being someone that people can look up to. I know it kind of, I don't know, I always feel like there's imposter syndrome for many of us, but you are someone who should be looked up to and someone who should be celebrated for everything that you do. And just thank you, Dr. Curiosity, for being on the front lines for women in science and science communication. It doesn't go unnoticed, and it should be 100% celebrated. So thank you for joining us this on our month of celebrating women in STEM, and for coming on. It's an absolute blast to have had you here and talk through your journey and your insight, and just thank you for everything that you do. That was Dr. Inés Dawson. You can find all links to her social media in the show notes. Thank you for listening. Until next time.